There are accounts of a man who willingly gave up one of his eyes, not in battle, not as punishment, as payment. The record does not describe anger or hesitation, only intent. Witnesses said he stood still, silent, and allowed the act to happen as if he understood something others did not. What he received in return was never clearly named. After the loss of his eye, people noticed changes that were difficult to explain. He spoke less. When he did speak, his words felt deliberate, almost measured. Some said he could recognize patterns in events before they unfolded. Others claimed he asked questions no one else thought to ask, questions that lingered long after he left. Those who met him described an unsettling presence. Not threatening, not comforting, simply observant. He watched people the way one might watch weather forming in the distance, not with judgment, but with attention. Many later claimed they felt seen in ways that made them uneasy, as if parts of their lives had been quietly examined. There is no single origin recorded for him. Different regions place his arrival years apart. In some accounts he appeared during times of famine, in others on the eve of conflict, always alone, always walking, never staying long enough to be questioned properly. The records agree on one detail. He always wore the mark of his sacrifice. People asked him what he had gained by giving up his eye. He never answered directly. Instead, he asked what they were willing to lose. Those who pressed further often reported a sense of discomfort, as if the conversation had shifted away from words and into something more personal. Several witnesses claimed he warned leaders of events yet to come, defeats, betrayals, the slow collapse of alliances. He did not offer solutions, only knowledge. Those who listened sometimes survived longer than expected. Those who ignored him often became footnotes in later records. It is unclear whether he sought power. There are no accounts of him ruling or commanding armies. His influence moved differently, quietly, indirectly. He seemed more interested in understanding how events unfolded than in controlling them. This distinction confused many who encountered him. Animals reportedly followed him at times. Ravens appear frequently in these accounts, though the descriptions vary. Some say they circled above him, others claim they rested near him as if waiting. The records never explain this detail, only repeat it with unusual consistency. In older texts, he is described as a collector of knowledge, not books, not artifacts, experiences, conversations, observations. He appeared wherever something significant was about to happen, as if drawn by the weight of the moment rather than by place. Over time, stories about him began to change. What was once described as a man became something harder to define. The sacrifice of his eye was no longer seen as a loss, but as a threshold. Some began to wonder whether he had seen too much to remain entirely human. As his presence became more widely reported, contradictions began to appear in the records. Some claimed he was elderly. Others swore he had not aged at all. A few described meeting him decades apart, unchanged in posture and voice. Scribes attempted to reconcile these differences, but no explanation satisfied all accounts. He was often seen speaking with rulers before critical decisions were made. These meetings were brief and rarely documented in detail. What remains are fragments, warnings written in margins, annotations that suggest hesitation where confidence once existed. His involvement was never credited openly. Those who accepted his knowledge paid a price, though not always immediately. Some lost influence, others lost peace. The information he offered seemed to alter the path of their lives, not toward safety, but toward inevitability. Knowing more did not always make survival easier. In several regions, he was associated with the gathering of warriors before large-scale conflicts. He did not recruit, he observed, standing at the edges of camps, listening. The soldiers later recalled feeling watched, as if their fates had already been weighed. Strangely, there are no records of him celebrating victory. He appeared equally present before triumph and disaster. This pattern led some chroniclers to conclude that outcomes held little interest for him. What mattered was the moment when choice turned into consequence. Travelers reported encountering him on long roads between settlements. He walked without visible supplies, yet never appeared weakened by hunger or exhaustion. When asked where he was going, he reportedly answered with questions rather than destinations. In poetry written long after these events, he is described as a listener rather than a speaker, someone who gathered stories the way others gathered weapons. These verses emphasize silence, patience, and the weight of accumulated knowledge. There are references to symbols carved into wood and stone near places he passed through. Simple marks, easily overlooked. Later interpretations suggest these were warnings or reminders, though their meanings were never agreed upon. As the stories spread, fear began to mix with reverence. Some communities welcomed him, hoping for insight. Others closed their gates, believing his presence signaled approaching hardship. Both reactions appear in equal measure across the records. What remains consistent is the sense that encounters with him marked a turning point. People did not leave unchanged. Even when nothing happened immediately, something shifted, as if a future had quietly been acknowledged. In several accounts, his arrival coincided with moments of hesitation. Councils delayed decisions, generals postponed attacks. Leaders who had appeared certain suddenly asked for time. Some historians later questioned whether these pauses altered the course of events or merely revealed doubts that already existed. Those who tried to follow him rarely succeeded. He walked with steady pace but left no clear trail. Travelers described losing sight of him in open terrain, as if distance itself worked differently around him. Attempts to document his path ended in gaps and unfinished maps. There are descriptions of him sitting near wells, crossroads, and borders, places where movement converged. He did not speak unless addressed, and even then his replies felt incomplete, forcing listeners to confront their own interpretations rather than offering clarity. Some accounts suggest he tested people, not through challenges but through questions, simple ones. What are you willing to lose? What do you fear knowing? These exchanges were brief, yet remembered with unusual intensity by those involved. In one fragment, a chronicler writes that the man warned of a great conflict years before it occurred. The warning was dismissed at the time. When the conflict later unfolded almost exactly as described, the record was revisited and heavily amended. His single remaining eye is often described in detail, not as damaged or weak but sharp and unsettling. Witnesses claimed it felt as if he was observing not just actions, but intentions. This detail appears repeatedly across independent sources. Several poems describe him exchanging knowledge for sacrifice, not always physical, sometimes loyalty, sometimes silence. Those who accepted these terms rarely spoke publicly afterward, leaving behind only indirect traces of their encounters. In regions where literacy was rare, oral tradition preserved his image differently. Elders spoke of a man who knew the endings of stories before they were told. Children were warned not to ask him questions they did not want answered. Attempts to categorize him failed repeatedly. He was not a messenger nor a ruler, nor a prophet in the traditional sense. Each label explained part of his behavior, but left the rest unresolved, resisting classification. By this point in the records, the idea that he was merely human had begun to weaken, not because of any single act, but because of the accumulation of patterns that no ordinary life could easily explain. As the stories accumulated, so did attempts to explain him away. Some scholars argued that multiple men had been merged into one figure over time. Others suggested exaggeration. Yet these theories struggled to account for the consistency of details that appeared in places with no contact between them. In a remote settlement, records mention a traveler who arrived before a devastating winter. He warned that supplies would not last. The warning was ignored. Months later, survivors recalled his words with unsettling clarity, as if they had been meant to be remembered rather than acted upon. Several rulers attempted to keep him close, hoping to benefit from his insight permanently. These attempts failed. He refused offers of shelter, titles, or protection. He stayed only long enough to observe the moment when choice hardened into outcome. One account describes him standing beside a battlefield after the fighting had ended. He did not mourn the dead or praise the living. He walked among the fallen silently, as though committing something to memory rather than reacting to what he saw. Those who followed him long enough reported a sense of unease, not fear, the feeling of being in the presence of something that understood time differently, as if past, present, and future were less distinct to him than they were to others. Animals continued to appear in these narratives. Ravens, wolves, and horses recur with unusual frequency. Chroniclers disagreed on their significance, but few denied their presence. The repetition suggests intention rather than coincidence. In one surviving letter, a scribe admits uncertainty about whether he was recording history or myth. The man's actions were subtle, but their consequences rippled outward in ways that felt disproportionate to a single individual. Communities began to associate his arrival with transformation, not always destruction, sometimes survival, sometimes loss avoided at great cost. The common thread was change that could not be undone once it began. There are no records of him aging, no mention of illness, no account of death. This absence became as notable as his appearances, raising questions scribes were reluctant to answer directly. By now, some records no longer described him as a man at all. Language shifted. He became a presence, a watcher, something that moved through the world, gathering knowledge rather than belonging to it. As his story spread, language struggled to keep up. Scribes began using metaphor where description failed. He was compared to a shadow that appeared only at significant moments, or to a wind that arrived before storms. These were not poetic choices at first, but attempts to capture something that resisted precise recording. In some regions, rituals emerged around his supposed appearances. People left offerings at crossroads and wells, not to appease him, but to acknowledge that knowledge always demanded payment. Whether these practices began before or after his visits remains unclear. There are fragmented accounts of him speaking to those on the brink of exile or death. These encounters were never described in full. What survives are outcomes. A condemned man spared, a traitor choosing silence, decisions altered without explanation. Attempts to confront him directly ended in frustration. Those who demanded answers received questions instead. Those who accused him of manipulation found themselves unable to prove intent. His influence left no fingerprints, only altered trajectories. Some records suggest he knew the cost of his own sacrifice more deeply than anyone else, that giving up his eye was not an act of gain, but of narrowing. Seeing more required surrendering something forever. In later retellings, his journeys were said to span not only lands but eras. He appeared in moments separated by generations, unchanged. Whether this was literal or symbolic remains debated, though no single explanation resolved all accounts. A recurring detail in these stories is silence. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were brief and precise, leaving listeners to confront implications on their own. So over time, fear gave way to reverence, reverence to ritual, ritual to myth. The man became a figure invoked rather than encountered, his actions distilled into stories meant to warn or instruct. Yet some sources resist this transformation. They insist he was real, that he walked, observed, and departed, that the myth grew not from invention, but from the inability of language to contain what had been witnessed. These sources end without resolution. They offer no proof, only accumulation, a pattern of appearances too consistent to dismiss, yet too incomplete to confirm. The kind of record that survives when certainty does not. In some late records, a name begins to appear, though never consistently. It is written differently depending on the region, sometimes shortened, sometimes avoided altogether. Scribes treat it carefully, as if naming him too clearly might collapse the distance that had kept the story intact. Those who used the name did so sparingly, often at the end of a passage, almost as an afterthought, as if the name itself was less important than the actions attributed to it. In several cases, the name is scratched out and replaced with titles like Wanderer or Watcher. One surviving poem describes him hanging between life and death in pursuit of knowledge. The imagery is stark and unsettling. Scholars argue whether this reflects an event or a metaphor layered onto earlier accounts. What remains undisputed is the theme of sacrifice repeated throughout the tradition. Another fragment claims that his search for understanding never ended. That knowledge, once obtained, only revealed further absence. The text suggests that his wandering was not a choice, but a consequence of what he had learned. Communities that preserved his story did not depict him as benevolent or cruel. They described him as necessary, a presence tied to moments when the future demanded acknowledgement, whether people welcomed it or not. In border regions, elders warned travelers about speaking too freely near crossroads. They said some questions invited attention, that certain kinds of curiosity carried weight, and once noticed, could not be undone. There are no stories of him granting comfort. He offered no reassurance. His role, as described, was to reveal, to strip away illusions that made decisions easier but consequences harsher. As generations passed, the line between record and reverence blurred further. What began as testimony became chant. Chant became legend. Yet the core details remained remarkably stable beneath the embellishment. Some historians argue that this stability is evidence of deliberate preservation rather than invention, that people kept these details because they believed forgetting them would be dangerous. By this stage, the story no longer belonged to a single place or time. It had become a shared memory, carried forward less for explanation than for warning. In the final surviving records, certainty gives way to restraint. Writers stop trying to explain who he was and focus instead on when he appeared, always before turning points, always before consequences that could no longer be avoided. Some texts suggest that his purpose was never to change outcomes, only to witness them, that his presence marked moments when humanity crossed lines it could not uncross, whether through ambition, fear, or the pursuit of knowledge itself. There are warnings embedded in these accounts, though rarely stated directly. Knowledge is described as a weight rather than a gift, something that sharpens vision but narrows choice. Once seen, certain things cannot be unseen. In one of the last fragments, a scribe admits that writing the story felt dangerous, not because it was forbidden, but because recording it might invite attention. The text ends abruptly, unfinished, as if the author chose silence instead. Later generations inherited the story without its original context. They called it myth, they called him a god. These labels offered distance, making the account safer to repeat without confronting its implications. The sacrifice of the eye became symbolic in retellings, yet the earliest records insist it was real. Flesh given for sight, loss exchanged for understanding, a transaction that could not be reversed. Some traditions claim he still walks, not openly, not often, appearing only when curiosity outweighs caution, when people seek answers without considering the cost of knowing them. Whether this is belief or metaphor remains unresolved. The story survives because it refuses to settle into certainty. It lingers in the space between warning and memory. Those who hear the story are left with a question rather than a lesson. What would you be willing to sacrifice to understand what lies ahead? And what would that understanding take from you in return? They gave him many names over time. Most have faded. One remains, whispered rather than spoken. And even now, no record agrees on whether it was a god they described or a man who saw too much to remain only human.